I'm not in the medical field. I'm not a data scientist. I'm not an AI. I'm not a venture capitalist. So why am I here? So I'm supposed to help tee you up for the next conference, which is on inclusion and equity. I'm a social scientist, a political economist, and I'm going to talk about how to put some of this into a somewhat different framework. Now, you've all seen this cover of the New Yorker, though one of the things I learned today now from several people and should have known is that before we get to this point, if we ever get to this point, we're going to see the retail workers taking money from the healthcare workers, right? There's so many healthcare workers coming online, but none of them are being paid all that well. I don't really think the robots will take our jobs, but it is a question, and there's lots of information in both directions. We see other kinds of data that show that workers are staying put. This is from James Suriecki, who also writes for The New Yorker, as well as for Wired magazine. And what this graph shows is that automation were throwing masses of people out of work. You'd see lots of churn or movement from job to job. But the rate of churn today is at an historic low, suggesting that automation is not taking over as quickly as that New Yorker cover suggested. This is a book I really love. John Markoff was here earlier today, may be back again. Machines of Loving Grace, which he wrote when he was a visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. And he makes an argument about artificial intelligence versus augmented intelligence. And a lot of what we've been talking about today really is the second, not so much the first. Even in the most sophisticated versions of artificial intelligence, it's augmenting human judgment, human action, human decisions. Whichever way it goes, and as I said, this is still very much a debate, there are people who are going to be displaced. Every single big technological change that's happened in the past has displaced people. The Industrial Revolution ended up creating more jobs than it lost, but in the interim, lots of people were thrown off their land. Lots of people were put in conditions they'd never experienced before. It was rough. And it took well over 100 years to really develop a welfare system or other kind of mechanism to deal with that. We have to recognize that whatever happens, even if it ends up in greater productivity, even if it ends up in people better off in the long run, the short run, the medium run is going to create lots of displacement. And how are we going to provide for those who are displaced? How are we going to deal with that? How are we thinking about that? And how do we ensure dignity and meaning? One of the things that could happen in the future is that there will be fewer jobs, but lots of work. As Tim O'Reilly notes, and many others have noted, as long as there are things to do, there's work to do. We have a lot of big problems out there: climate change, poverty, disease for people who aren't as lucky as we are, and even for some of us who are. So how are we going to get people to recognize that they can do work, reward them for work, even if they don't have a job, and how do we ensure that they have dignity and meaning while they do that kind of work, whether it be volunteer or whether it be some other kind of way of providing for it? Where there is no argument, and we've heard no argument today, we started with John Hennessy telling us that there's some real problems in supervised learning, because if you have bad data going in, you're going to have bad learning going out. Rich Caruana reminded us that we shouldn't get rid of any data when we have huge data sets. But in many cases, we don't have huge data sets. We have very messy, small data sets. There's real bias in algorithms because of the kind of data that comes into them. I'm thinking, for example, of the case of the studies of oncology that were based only on male patients. Strange. They're not the only people who get oncological diseases. There are all kinds of neighborhood effects that disguise individual data because the data isn't analyzed properly and it's incomplete data. Discriminatory effects can be replicated or created as a result of problematic data or incomplete data. So I'm thinking here of a lot of the data sets that have been created and being sold, the algorithms that are being sold to help with either sentencing or bail for criminal defendants. They're very problematic, very biased because of we don't have Rich Caruana checking it. These are not companies that are worried about that kind of quality of the data, and the judges are complaining, let alone the poor people who don't get bail or the people who are thrown in jail inappropriately because of sentencing problems. That's not to say that some of these data sets couldn't be improved and these algorithms could be improved to the benefit of people. We don't want judges who have just come back after lunch making sentencing decisions, something else we know about that. So we really have to work on these data sets, and I heard a lot of information today and a lot of optimism about doing that. I just want to show you one other kind of problem now. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Can you do that little video right now? Some of you will see this.
Hello, I'm Joy, a poet of code on a mission to stop an unseen force that's rising, a force that I called the coded gaze, my term for algorithmic bias. Algorithmic bias, like human bias, results in unfairness. However, algorithms like viruses can spread bias on a massive scale at a rapid pace. Algorithmic bias can also lead to exclusionary experiences and discriminatory practices. Let me show you what I mean. Hi, camera. I've got a face. Can you see my face? No glasses face? You can see her face. What about my face? Well, I've got a mask. Can you see my mask?
You can stop
So
it now.
how did this...
Going back to my slides. Okay, there's an example where we don't yet have the tools. It's not just that the data is problematic. We actually really have to work on how we're going to make visual recognition and other kinds of things. Now, I know Fei Li is working on this, and many others are too, but nonetheless, this is the state of the art at the moment. And many of the things that we are trying to use our algorithms and our AI to deal with. So what do? It seems to me that bias in algorithms is both the easier and sometimes the harder problem of the ones that I want to deal with today. Good data is obviously one way in which you can resolve the bias in data. There are various forms of randomness that you can introduce, and the statisticians among you will know more about this than I do. I know you do. There's a combination of trained human judgment expertise with the AI and with the algorithms, and that is a lot of what we've been talking about today. But the other kinds of problems are harder, even harder to resolve. The issue of how are we going to compensate people who are displaced or don't have the resources to buy the services, the health care, the various other things that they need to survive in the current world. We're in a very, as we know, unequal society. Almost all of us are in an unequal society. So we need a decent form of social insurance. And if you think it's hard to get bias out of algorithms, try to think about the politics of today and creating a decent form of social insurance around which we could coalesce as a society. This is a really hard political and economic problem, but one we absolutely have to confront, and some of us are beginning to. How do we get human meaning and dignity? How do we reframe people's minds? How do we create new kinds of mindsets that give dignity to care work, something that has been dissed almost since it began, which is when we began as humans? It's the work of women. It's the work of immigrants. It's the work of the people that we don't value very highly. So how do we reframe so that the work of certain kinds of professionals, certain kinds of one gender in particular, isn't the only work that's valued? And that's a really significant change of attitudes and perceptions about what constitutes work versus a job, and what's valuable about a whole variety of kinds of work that we haven't adequately valued. It's also a change in attitude about the actual, what we think is important in this society, about what kind of work should be done. Care work is demeaned, not just because of who does it, but it's very low on the totem pole. Cleaning up our environment, at least if it's not some high-tech way to do it, if it's the sanitation workers, if it's the people who are cleaning up the water in our ponds and other things, is not highly valued work. So we need to really have a significant mindset change about that. So what do we need to do? Here I'm showing you two very famous white men, John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman. And what I'm going to argue is we need to go way beyond them. We need a new theory of the political and moral economy. Where we are now, in the particular form of neoliberalism that pervades most of the capitalist world, if we think about the forms of socialism or new forms of capitalism that are in other parts of the world, they're fraying almost everywhere. China seems to be doing all right in some regards in terms of its political economy, but it's too got its very major problems. Some of them going to be created by demography, some of them created by its government, some of them created by its incentives. I would argue that almost every one of our moral and political economies that we live under in the world today are fraying, that we're seeing real problems with them and real concerns that people are not getting what they need. So we really have to rethink and start to put some serious energy into developing some new moral and political economies. And I use moral because even though these people talked largely about political economies, implicit in every single political economy is a set of values, of things that we think are the important moral and ethical questions or the particular value goals that should be followed. So freedom in Free to Choose, or The Road from Serfdom from Hayek, were the values that are really incorporated in their vision of political economy. Are those the values that we want to incorporate into the future? Do we want to think about equity and inclusion, for example? Do we want to think about other values as being more primary? That's part of why we want to call it a moral political economy, and we're starting to generate a network of people to think about these issues. There's several networks going on right now. It is a really critical moment to rethink this, and it's going to have implications, obviously, for healthcare, for the way in which we deliver a whole variety of things. But to develop a new moral political economy, we also need to really revise our theories of behavior. And this is where AI can come back in a way, because it can help us in this process. But equally important, and even more important, perhaps, have been some social scientists, not just economists. Richard Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize, and I'm proud to say was a former CASBES fellow, is an economist. Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize earlier than he did, is a political scientist, was a political scientist, unfortunately deceased, and one of my mentors and friends. And Daniel Kahneman, who's also won the Nobel Prize, and also a former CASBES fellow, is a psychologist. And what they all have in common is really rethinking the underlying assumptions of neoclassical economics that really have pervaded since the 19th century. Really thinking about Homo economicus as the way of thinking about how people make decisions, strive, what they value, that maximizing or optimizing income was the primary thing. And not that they're homo and femina socio, that they are social beings who think about their interactions, who may value some ethical, in certain circumstances, will put ethical concerns higher than their economic concerns, or will trade them off at the right price, if you will. So we need to think about the ways in which people make decisions. Some of those decisions, as we know from Kahneman, are very faulty decisions, that they can't always, people have trouble processing and information and coming up with the right heuristic. They have all kinds of problems in the ways in which they make decisions. Individuals are not the rational individual of Homo economicus. But that doesn't mean they're stupid. That doesn't mean that they don't have values. That doesn't mean that that decision-making process can't be helped. And that's, again, where AI can come in. So we've seen many examples today of where the human decision process wouldn't be adequate for making a certain kind of diagnosis or for engaging in a certain kind of practice. But that can be augmented by machines, but it still requires human judgment. So intelligence that's added to rather than intelligence that's replaced. So one other thing I want to emphasize, and this comes from a book that I did with a current CASBIS fellow and co-author, John Alquist, is that one of the things we ought to think about is how to expand our community of fate, not faith, fate. And what do I mean by that? That means thinking about those individuals with whom we come to perceive our own fates as intertwined, as bound, and with whom we're willing to act in solidarity. Now, we all have communities of fate. We care a lot about our families, or a group of friends, maybe our university colleagues. There's always a group of people with whom we feel some solidaristic feeling and are willing to make some sacrifices, often costly sacrifices, on behalf of them. But the issue is to make that a more expanded community of faith. There was a mention earlier, I guess Caliph talked about this, of a polarized world in the United States, of those people who, in the so-called red states versus the blue states, the people who buy leisure wear versus the people who buy clothes to go to the gym with, to actually go to the gym with. And the gifts of going to the gym and getting personal training versus buying a gun or a big truck. Those groups have their own communities of fate. We need to find a way to cross those communities of fate. We need to find those issues in which those two groups talk to each other. One thing we know does it, war, and maybe that's where we're headed. And then a certain kind of nationalism comes in, but we can do better than that. We can find things like healthcare, which affects all of us, which is costly. We can find things like climate, which may help bring us all together into a common conversation and some collective commitments to doing something together. And that's part of creating a new moral political economy. So what are the critical components of what I'm advocating here? An economic infrastructure that's based on and serving a more social and ethical human than that embodied in the traditional rational Homo economicus. A governance structure that's built to serve all members of the community and not just the privileged few, or the very particularistic interest that gets served by the way in which the system is currently structured. A social infrastructure that provides links among diverse communities and people. And a value structure that elevates both the need for survival and the need for dignity. Mine is a very short talk relative to others because I thought we would have time for discussion and question, and I'm keeping you from the bar. Thank you.
Any last calls for our discussion? Thank you so much, Professor Levy, for a much broader scope discussion and bigger questions that we should be thinking about. Thinking about some of your discussion on, is displacement going to happen? We're going to try to do all these advances, and inevitably some people get left behind. I actually very much believe that's probably going to happen, but I also feel like I have no idea what to do about it. Do you have any thoughts on what can we do about it? Are there examples of something that did work in the past?
Yeah, well, what worked in the past was developing a welfare system of some sort that spoke to what the community had become as opposed to what it was. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, what happened was peasants, people who worked the land, moved to the cities and became workers, okay? They suddenly, instead of, they were under a very different pay system. They were in very different health conditions. So you had to develop, one, you had to expand the franchise so that they had some voice and had some say about what went on for them. It actually started with the middle class, for whom some of them were working. And it became an investment of society to prevent both chaos and to prevent rebellion, as well as an investment of those who began to have the vote to try to make some changes. It was a very long struggle. But the result of that struggle, which we could shorten, we know much more now than we did then, the result of that struggle was the beginning of the modern welfare system, which meant that there was some kind of unemployment compensation, there were health and safety regulations, there were hours regulations, there were a variety of government interventions, different in different countries, as at beginning to be, you began to see some convergence, some differences. The welfare state of today of the Nordic countries is very different and much more liberal in many ways than the welfare state of Britain, the US, Australia, the Anglo-Saxon democracies.
Kind of with that lens, how do you perceive, I mean, at this point, a decade or years worth of drama over healthcare reform, of health insurance coverage, and ultimately, is somebody else's health my problem? I don't feel like it should be. And how does that play out compared to where we've been and where we might go?
Well, one of the reasons that we need to really rethink our governance structures as well as our economic structures is that we have a very gridlocked system right now. And, we'll have elections soon-ish in this country, and it might change some of that, but it's going to be at the margin. There are some deep problems in the way, and it's a fabulous constitution that's now 200 years old, and it's had to have amendments before, and it probably has to have amendments again. And that brings me to the real way we're going to change this is really a kind of mobilization where we begin to really identify we need some leadership. We need some very visionary leadership and some voices that will help us to understand where our common goals are as opposed to the things that take us apart. That's happened in the past. It's possible, and hopefully can happen without a war.
Following
or
up
a
actually
plague.
So the common enemy, or alien invasion. Kind of going back to...
alien invasion might do it.
might do it. Following up
Or they
Rob,
might have a better idea. They might just impose something.
I think they'll be shocked to see where we're at. Rob Califf kind of made these comments, really getting at some of this consolidating some of our collective will in some way. Is AI and technology going to help that, or is it actually being used to make it even harder and polarizing us even further?
Well, looking at the immediate past, it's obviously, at least in the political sphere, been polarizing us. It creates echo chambers of a variety of kinds, and the ways in which bots and trolls and other such devices have been used has not exactly been inspiring of bringing us together. That being said, that doesn't mean that's the end of the story. We're seeing a lot of pushback right now, not just in the US, certainly more in Europe than in the US, but all over the world, about how to control that kind of polarizing behavior on the parts of AIs and bots and the like, and how to create, but we aren't seeing a lot of vision yet about how to enable those tools to help do what I've just been saying, is to create common vision. We're seeing some efforts at that, but I suspect there will be a lot more. People are really upset and angry right now. There's lots of evidence for that. And that's a moment when you begin to see certain kinds of destructiveness, but you also see certain kinds of creativity.
Maybe don't waste
I mean,
a good
one of the
crisis.
things I've studied a lot is the labor union movement. And the labor union movement has gone through many, many phases. Right now in the US, it's pretty close to moribund. But while it was still alive and kicking, it went through many, many phases. And as technology changed, it changed. And new forms of organizing developed that reached more people than ever before. So out of those what seemed like awful moments, Great Depressions, huge disruptions caused by technology, they're often fabulous creative moments.
Very good. For time, I'll throw in one last question. You wrote a perspective recently. You talked a lot about bias already, but actually you told us in a perspective, we should also be thinking, maybe worried more, and it's very obvious with the Facebook, Cambridge Analytica brouhaha, how much of our data is now consolidated in certain entities and how we should feel about that. And certainly our health data is basically consolidated in health systems now.
Right.
And what are the dangers and implications that we should be thoughtful of? I don't think people realize how much we're being monitored. Now we're going to have ambient sensors just watching what we're doing every day.
I thought about that.
Yeah, and and it's not that it wasn't happening before. It's just now people maybe are more aware of it. And what is the response?
So I went into the bathroom, wasn't sure if I was washing my hands right. I was about to ask. Did I do it long enough? Yes, I think we have a serious monopoly problem, something else that periodically comes up. Over the course of the history of capitalism, we've run into this before. And there needs to be some regulatory, I know that I'm in Silicon Valley and you're not supposed to mention regulation. I'll probably be shot before I leave the room in some version or another. But we do need to think about some form of control of these things. And regulations don't have to be, a big foot that stamps out what the company has built, but it does need to create some rules about how things needed to be guided and some standards about what kinds of things have to be met. And the experience of almost all of history is that the corporations who have an interest in their own product are not necessarily, in fact, never, there must be an exception to that, but virtually never, the best regulators of their own problematic behavior that's been generated by their firms, even if the leadership has the best intentions in the world.
Very good. Once more time, thank you so much again, Professor Levi. Thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you for participating today. A fantastic day. Thank you so much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.